continuing on with our topic of transoceanic voyages of the years 1450 to 1750. Sorry about the creaky chair there, which I keep that to a minimum. And now we're on to exploration, the causes of it, and then also the events of the early exploration, right? So there are some pretty interesting reasons for exploration. So what we see first off is that we see the Italians, the Italian city-states like Venice especially, control trade into the Mediterranean, right, and controlling access to trade routes, right? And so because of that, right, we're going to want to see a desire for the non-Italian countries to find new routes to Asia. Okay. Another reason we're going to see it is the explorers themselves, right, hope to find gold and silver, right? Stories like El Dorado, right, the city of gold. Okay. And then on top of that, we also want to see they also want to see converts to Christianity, right? They want to spread their religion as it's part of the religion, right? So these are the major reasons for exploration, or at least some of the major reasons. Okay. Another important reason, though, is the role of the state. Right, states were very important for exploration, right? Because, well, frankly, it's not economically viable for an individual to lead exploration attempts on their own, right? So we also see a lot of growth of these European states during this time period, right, within Europe, right, in terms of their power, right. We see new wealth through in these states, right. And we also see especially the growth of silver wealth in Europe. Okay, and so especially after exploration, right? And so what we see also is that we have the kind of rivals, right? The rivalries amongst European states, right? The rivalries amongst states leads to desires to kind of go out and colonize before others. And that's one of the major goals as well, is to kind of get out ahead of the other states that are rivals, so that you also don't want to, lose out on some good territory, and also kind of prevent your other your rivals from not getting that territory, right? So we see kind of they talk about Columbus being supported by the state of Spain specifically, right? And then on top of this, we have the introduction of a new. Actually, let's kind of talk about that, right? We would see states fund exploration due to its expense. Right, we already talked about Prince Henry in the last section. Columbus is supported by the Spanish government, despite himself not being Spanish, right, etc. And then we have the topic of mercantilism. So mercantilism is a couple of things, right? The main one is the measure of wealth of a country is determined by not by money, but rather the amount of gold and silver they have. Right, and so in an attempt to create more gold and silver, right, they attempt to increase exports, right, selling goods to other countries in order to get metals from them, and decrease imports in order to prevent their using their own gold and silver to get goods from other countries, right? Which, of course, if everybody's increasing their exports and decreasing their imports, then really nobody's doing either, right? Or at least nobody's especially increasing their exports, because, if everybody's decreasing their imports, that means nobody's buying from anybody else, which means there's no exports, unless you have a colony, right? Unless you have a colony that is forced to buy from you. Okay. So mercantilism will be kind of the major economic philosophy of Europe until capitalism shows up in the 1700s or so, maybe a little earlier than that. Okay. So let's talk about the expansion of exploration. And we start our conversation of exploration with the Portuguese, right? Portugal had to expand overseas, right, because they were landlocked by Aragon and Castile, right? And so there's three key people here. Again, Prince Henry the Navigator, who I'm not going to go into too much more detail on. We've already talked about him. But he was the political leader, right? Helped fund these navigations, right? Looking for gold, right? And also began the slave trade under him. We also have Bartholomew Diaz, also Bartolomeo Diaz. He sails around. Well, actually, let's get our third guy up here first before I kind of talk about that. And then we get Vasco da Gama. Okay, kind of our three major exploring adventurers, right? So again, Henry the Navigator looking for African gold. And also under him, we see the beginning of the African slave trade. Okay, Bartholomew Diaz goes around the Cape of Good Hope. So he's the first one to do that from Europe. And then lastly, Vasco da Gama makes his way to Egypt, or excuse me, not Egypt, India. Brings back with him some pepper and some spices, right? And that kind of sets up the ability for the Portuguese to make their presence felt in the Indian Ocean, right? And that presence in the Indian Ocean is led by a admiral, Afonso de Albuquerque. Okay, so Afonso de Albuquerque is the kind of responsible for setting up the Indian Ocean Empire. He takes over Malacca from Arab traders, right? He also helped kind of take over Portuguese India as well, right? We even start to see the Portuguese make their way over to China, right? They start trading in China a century after Zheng He and his explorations were cut short because they didn't want foreign influence, right? And so they took over both the African and Indian coasts as well, right? They basically take over the entire basin of the Indian Ocean, but they don't necessarily take it over as territory, right? They take it over in a different way, which we're going to talk about here in a second, right? So they start trading in China, and then kind of after that first visit, we see they talk about Franciscan and Dominican missionaries, but we really want to focus on the Jesuit missionaries. Come over to spread Christianity, and especially Matteo Ricci. They also talk about Adam Shaw von Bell, but we're not going to focus too much on him. But they fail to really convert anybody in China because they consider non-Chinese religions to be below them, right? And so they don't necessarily deem Christianity worth their time. Okay. And so we see the Portuguese create a series of trading posts in what we call the Trading Post Empire. Sorry for all that commotion. My cat is running around. She just ate, so she's full of energy. Now she's on the couch. On top of the couch, I should say. So the Trading Post Empire is based around two things, right? It's over control of major trade points within the Indian Ocean. And then also restricting trade by controlling who had what are called these permits, right? Right, they would issue permits to trade to different merchants, right? If you paid enough, right? Which kind of allowed them to tax the trade a little bit more and also control who got to trade where, right? And they talk about some of the major ports, and there are probably three we want to focus on as the major places where they were able to control trade: Goa in India, Hormuz on the Persian Gulf, and then of course Malacca on the Strait of Malacca, right? And so their major goal with all of this controlled trade posts is to get a monopoly on spices, monopoly on the spice trade, right? Because spices were very profitable, and if they could be the only ones who were buying and selling it, they would make a lot of money. Okay, so that's kind of how they start, but the Portuguese are quite vulnerable, right? They are a very small nation. with not a lot of resources and not a lot of population, right? And they don't necessarily have the resources to keep up this empire, and especially don't have the resources when you see merchants ignoring the government. And when the government is not ignored, the government being corrupt, right? Basically kind of skimming off the top, right? Kind of taking money for themselves, right? So those are all big issues. And so because of this, we see kind of some bigger states, and specifically the Dutch and the English kind of take over large chunks of the Portuguese Empire. The Dutch, especially in the Malay Peninsula, right, in Malaysia and Indonesia. And they will end up controlling the spice trade themselves. And the English in India. And they will end up controlling cotton and tea. All right. And so we see that kind of come to an end. They talk about the brief Portuguese visits to Japan, but I'm not going to focus too much on that. Another area where we see the Europeans is, and the only place we really see the Spanish in the Indian Ocean trade kind of sphere, right, is in the Philippines. But first, let's talk about Ferdinand Magellan, who is I believe he's Portuguese, but he does sail for the country of Spain. And if you know anything about Ferdinand Magellan, you should know that his crew, not him, his crew is the first to circumnavigate the globe. He dies on the way. So his ships made it all the way around. And so one of the places they stopped was the Philippines. And so Spain takes over the Philippines after Magellan kind of claimed it for them, named after the king, King Philip, right? And so they claim it, and then 50 years later, they come back to kind of stake their claim, especially focusing on the port of Manila, right, which would be a very important port, and especially attracts a migrant group of Chinese merchants, because as we're going to see here, Spain is going to use this port to import silver into the Philippines, right? And we also see, of course, the Philippines become a very Christian nation, one of the most Christian nations on earth at this point, based on kind of per capita religious affiliation. Okay. All right. So now they're talking about the lure of riches, right? The lure of wealth, especially in the Americas, right? And so originally there's not a whole lot of demand for exploration of the Americas. After the first few decades, they don't really get a whole lot going on. But once we start to see the discovery of the Aztecs and the Inca, who both have quite a lot of wealth, especially gold and silver, leads to an interest in colonizing and exploring the Americas once again. Right, and also settling the area, right? And then on top of that, they also realized that they could start to use the either Native Americans, right, or the Africans later on, to create a much cheaper, more economically profitable system for the Europeans if they want to do things like, especially make sugar and tobacco. All right. Speaking of that trade across the Pacific to Manila, we have the Manila galleons. Galleons being these massive ships, these trade ships, right? So China really liked silver, especially because they're using it as a currency. I'm not entirely sure actually if they use it as a currency first, and then the Spanish traded to them, or the Spanish traded to them and then they started using it as currency second, right? Right, so we would see American silver traded across the Pacific into the Philippines to, Manila. And then from Manila, we would see Chinese merchants buy the silver. Right, and in return, they would get silk and spices, right? Silk, spices, and sometimes even gold for that, right? Which are all goods that they wanted. And what you actually see a lot of is this gold. So there was such a point. There was a point in time where silver was so important in China that it was actually worth more than gold. And so you would see the Spanish take that gold over to Japan, who also had a lot of silver, and would trade that gold for more silver to kind of create this system where they were, and then bring that silver back to China, right, getting more gold, right, creating this massive economic boom for the Spanish, right? And so what we see is that silver in the 17th century is kind of the dominant economic force in the global economy. If you have access to silver, you are in a very strong position economically, right? What we're going to see, though, that happens for Spain is that they're going to basically overinflate their economy through the use of silver within their internal economy and really decline because of that, right? So to kind of, but before that, right, to kind of try to break through the Spanish power, we see the French, which I'm going to shorten to FR, the British, which I'm going to shorten to BR, and the Dutch look for a northwest passage to Asia from through the Americas. And that desire to find a northwest passage is going to lead to a lot of the exploration of these countries. Okay, so starting with France. So France has a couple of guys that we need to know. Jacques Cartier, who I believe is the, is he Cartesian coordinates? Is that him? I could be wrong. I don't want to say anything on this video that I'm not sure is right or not. And then we have Samuel de Champlain. Right, so Jacques Cartier goes down the St. Lawrence River and finds Canada and claims part of Canada for France. Samuel de Champlain kind of starts to settle in Canada, right, because he recognizes that there's goods to be had there, right? And they don't find gold, right? They're looking for gold, but instead they find something possibly even more valuable, furs, right? And they establish their first trading post at the city of, the modern day city of Quebec, right? And so we see traders and we see fur traders and of course missionaries here, right? And then La Salle, the French trader, explores the Great Lakes and goes down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, right? La Salle does the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, claiming all of that territory for France, which of course will eventually be the Louisiana Purchase, right? Now, the French did it a bit differently than the Spanish. The Spanish will colonize territories. We didn't necessarily talk about that yet, but they will certainly colonize. The British will certainly colonize. The French did not. The French did not necessarily colonize, like put down massive communities. What the French did was that they created trade, right? They were a bunch of fur trappers, right, who traded with the natives, right? Traded with the Native Americans. Right, and so because of that, they had pretty good relations with the Native Americans, right? They were a trade partner rather than a conqueror, right? And so that was really good for them in terms of getting allies there. Okay, and they kind of talk about the colony of New France only having 70,000 people by 1754 compared to 1 million in the English colonies. Okay. Speaking of the English colonies and English exploration, we have one guy that they want us to point out here, which is John Cabot. So John Cabot, the major explorer, he gets the area from Newfoundland down to the Chesapeake Bay, basically creating a lot of the modern day New England, right? Now, at this point, at this early point on in the early 1500s, the British aren't a sea power, right? Especially in comparison to the Spanish, right? They did have the Sea Dog pirates, though, who would help kind of take a lot of pirate a lot of stuff from the Spanish, especially these Spanish ships going from the Caribbean to Europe, right? But then about a century later, 1588, right? So let's say 15th century, and then in 1588, not a year you need to remember, just kind of for context, we do see them defeat the Spanish Armada. Now, this defeat was almost lucky in a way. There was a huge storm that destroyed a good chunk of the ships, but they were able to defeat the Spanish Armada, which allows them to claim the title of being a naval power, and that allows them to really expand and start competing in the Americas for those resources, right? And the first colony that we see is in 1607, so about 20 years after that, in the Americas, and that, of course, is the colony of Jamestown, named after the king, King James, right, on the James River, also named after the king, who knew. And so that is the first successful English colony. There have already been successful Spanish colonies in the region, right? But yeah, there we go. Then lastly, we're going to talk about the Dutch. Okay, and the Dutch start theirs exploration with Henry Hudson. Henry Hudson explores the east coast of North America, and the key thing he sails up is the thing known as, well, hey, the Hudson River, all the way to the Hudson Bay, right? And so he discovers that area. He also discovers the territory that will eventually become New Amsterdam, which, of course, today is New York City. Right. And so they have their, they have their first little colonies here. They don't have a whole lot, but we do see the beginnings of Dutch colonialism, colonization here. And of course, New Amsterdam will be given to the British at some point here. But yeah, we see this kind of a key trade node for the Dutch, right? It's on the coast, right? They, especially for fur trade, right? Fur trade and tobacco trade, to go back to the Dutch, that they would sell within Europe, right? That then they would take those back to the Dutch. They would get manufactured goods in exchange, and then sell those within the colonies, creating a pretty profitable system for the Dutch, right? And so, yeah, that is the early aspects of exploration and colonization. That is going to do it for this section. In our next section, we're going to talk about the Columbian Exchange. But until then,